They say the internet is forever. Most people think that means your embarrassing photos. For Brandon, it meant the 40,000 people watching his live stream, including the one woman who controlled his $6 million inheritance. He was too busy mocking his grandfather's clothes and speech patterns for donations to notice her username in the chat. But Margaret noticed everything. And when she opened the trust document the next morning, she found the clause his grandfather had written years before, the one that let her remove any beneficiary who publicly demeans a family elder. Brandon thought humiliating his grandpa would be free content, but the old man was a retired judge who'd written a trust clause specifically for public family disrespect. The live stream wasn't a mistake. It was the exact trigger the document was designed to catch. The question is, did Richard plan for his own grandson to walk into that trap? Richard Halstead had spent his career building a reputation for precision. 32 years on the appellate bench taught him that words mattered, that small clauses buried in long documents could change lives. When he sat down with his estate attorney in 2017 to draft a generation-skipping trust for his 4 grandchildren, he added a provision that his lawyer, Margaret Chen, read twice before speaking. Any beneficiary who publicly demeaned a family elder could be removed by the trustee at her sole discretion, no appeal, no warning. Margaret asked if he was sure. Richard simply nodded. He had seen too many inheritance fights in probate court to trust the world's direction, and he believed the internet was turning ordinary grandchildren into performers who monetized the people they were supposed to protect. The trust held $6 million. It was structured to bypass the generation in the middle, distributing directly to the grandchildren when Richard died. While he was alive, Margaret had full discretionary authority for education, medical emergencies, a first home. And now, unknown to anyone, for a clause no one in the family had bothered to read. Brandon Halstead, the youngest grandchild, was 22 and hungry for fame. On the live streaming platform Pulse, he had built a following of nearly 40,000 subscribers by pranking strangers, mocking viral videos, and testing how far he could push a format he called family cringe. The algorithm rewarded edge. Every nasty joke earned a donation. Every public humiliation brought a new wave of followers. Brandon had learned to see his own family not as relatives, but as potential content, raw material to be shaped into engagement metrics. The idea landed on a lazy Wednesday afternoon. His grandfather was the perfect target, a 74-year-old man who wore blazers to breakfast, used words like civility, and still believed a handshake meant something. Brandon called him and pitched the stream as a small documentary project. "I want to show my audience where I come from, just you being you." Richard, who had noticed the Sunday phone calls had stopped, said yes without hesitation. He missed the boy. So he put on his navy blazer, brushed back his silver hair, and settled into the leather chair in his study, never suspecting that the camera was already rolling, that 40,000 strangers were already watching, and that the chat window was already filling with messages that turned his grandson's smile into something cold. The stream went live at 8:17 p.m. "All right, chat, we're doing something special tonight," Brandon said, smirking into his phone. "My grandpa thinks we're recording a documentary. Wait until you hear this guy talk." The donations began almost instantly. $5 for Boomer Wisdom, $20 for Grandpa Outfit Roast, $100 tagged with a message that said, "Make him explain a rotary phone." Richard walked into frame with the quiet dignity of a man who had presided over murder trials, unaware he was now the entertainment. Across town, Margaret Chen was not a woman who wasted time on social media. She had installed Pulse for exactly one reason: to monitor the public profiles of the Halstead grandchildren, whose trust she was sworn to enforce. When the notification flashed onto her screen, "Brandon is live, Boomer Cringe Compilation FT My Grandpa," she frowned, clicked, and began to watch. She saw Richard's face, kind and unsuspecting. She heard Brandon's narration, cruel and rehearsed. And she watched the chat scroll, thousands of strangers typing laughter at a man who had given his life to fairness. Margaret did not gasp. She did not call anyone. She simply reached for a legal pad and noted the date, the time, and the exact words Brandon used as he mocked his grandfather's pocket square. Then she reopened the trust file and began to draft a memorandum that would change everything, starting with the clause Richard had written years before, as if he had seen this exact moment coming. The stream lasted 93 minutes. By the time Brandon logged off, he had accumulated over $8,000 in donations and a trending spot on the Pulse front page. The chat was a river of mockery. "Grandpa looks like a funeral director," he said. "Civility again, drink, give him a flip phone." Richard answered every question with the same deliberateness he had once used to instruct juries on reasonable doubt. He spoke about the weight of a gavel, about the years he spent reading case law in this very study, about the importance of choosing words carefully because words could imprison or free. And Brandon laughed into the camera while 40,000 strangers laughed with him, none of them realizing that the man they were roasting had sentenced men to life in prison with the same calm he used to describe the weather. They only saw the silver hair and the navy blazer, repackaged as comedy for an audience that paid by the insult. Margaret Chen watched every second. She did not skip. She took screenshots, noted timestamps, and cataloged the donations. The largest single contribution, $200, arrived with a message the donor paid to have read aloud. "Ask him what it's like to be obsolete." Brandon read it without hesitation. Richard paused, a flicker of something crossing his face, but he recovered with a small, dignified smile. "Obsolete? I'm retired. There's a difference." The chat exploded with laugh emojis, and the donations doubled. Margaret wrote the quote down verbatim and underlined it twice. She finished her memorandum at 11:30 that night. The trust document was explicit. Any beneficiary who publicly demeans a family elder may be removed at the sole discretion of the trustee, without hearing, without prior notice. The language Richard had dictated to her 6 years earlier was as airtight as any appellate opinion he had ever written. But here is the pivot that reframes everything that came before. Richard had not written that clause as a generic protection. He had written it for Brandon. Specifically, when Brandon was 16, Richard caught him filming a prank on his grandmother, who was struggling with a jar while Brandon narrated her difficulty for his friend's amusement. Richard confiscated the phone, deleted the video, and told the boy, "If you ever do that publicly, I will write you out of existence." The boy had laughed. Richard did not laugh. 2 years later, when the trust was drafted, he sat in Margaret's office and said, "I need a provision for the grandson who runs faster with a phone than with his conscience." Margaret noted it in the file. She never forgot. So when she recognized Brandon's voice on the stream and saw the old man in the study, she already understood. This was not a random act of cruelty. It was the final confirmation of a pattern Richard had predicted, a trap that had been waiting for someone to spring it, and the spring had just been released by the very hands it was designed to catch. That night, Margaret sent Richard a single text. "The stream has been documented. The clause applies. I will proceed unless you object." Richard did not reply. Instead, he sat in the same leather chair, long after the stream ended, scrolling through the recorded broadcast on his own phone. He had known something was wrong when Brandon refused to let him see the screen, when the laughter came too quickly and the questions felt like bait. By the time Brandon stammered that it was just a silly thing, Richard already knew. He watched himself be mocked, watched the donations pile up, read the comments that called him a relic, a punchline, a boomer trophy. And he felt not anger, but a heavy, quiet sorrow that settled in his chest like a verdict already read. Later, he would tell Emily that the worst part was not the words. It was the silence of the grandson who had once sat on his knee and asked him to explain how justice works. But Margaret was not the only person watching that night. 200 miles away, Richard's niece Emily, Brandon's cousin, was scrolling Pulse on her lunch break. She saw the familiar backdrop of Richard's study, heard Brandon's commentary, and her stomach dropped. Emily was a beneficiary of the same trust, a 26-year-old social worker who had spent every Sunday for the past 3 years driving to Richard's house to cook dinner, tend his garden, and listen to his stories. She cared for him with a quiet devotion that expected nothing in return. She watched 5 minutes of the stream, then shut it off and called Richard directly. "Uncle, are you okay?" That simple sentence, delivered while Brandon was still counting his donations, would soon become the most valuable words spoken in the entire Halstead family. Because under the trust's redistribution provisions, if a beneficiary is removed, their share is reallocated to the remaining beneficiaries, with preference given to those who demonstrate active care and respect for the grantor. Margaret's files already bulged with records of Emily's visits, her calls, her grocery receipts, her small acts of kindness that she never thought to broadcast. And now, Margaret had the contrast she needed for the trust review: one grandchild who monetized humiliation for an audience of strangers, and another who called to see if he was all right. The legal machinery was turning, and it was turning toward a conclusion that would make the trust's true purpose brutally clear. But then came the second pivot, the one that changed the shape of the entire case. When Margaret reviewed the full chat transcript, she found something that made her pause. Among the anonymous usernames, one stood out: Halstead Legacy 2025. The account had joined the stream, watched for 40 minutes, and sent a single private message to Brandon that read, "You're about to lose everything." Brandon had ignored it, probably assuming it was a troll. Margaret traced the account. It belonged to Jason, Richard's eldest grandson, who had been removed from the trust 3 years earlier for drug-related arrests. He had been watching not to warn his brother, but to witness the fall he knew was inevitable. And now he was reaching out, not from concern, but from the cold satisfaction of someone who had already lost everything and wanted company. Margaret added the message to her file and closed the folder. The next morning, she convened the trust review with the single other officer required. She presented the stream recordings, the donations, the chat logs, the clause language, and the history of Richard's warning to Brandon years before. The deliberation lasted 11 minutes. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, Margaret signed the removal order. No hearing, no appeal. Brandon Halstead was no longer a beneficiary of the $6 million generation skipping trust. And at 3:15, as Brandon was editing a highlights reel of the stream to upload for more views, his phone buzzed with an email from an address he did not recognize. The subject line read, "Trust review notification, urgent and final." Brandon opened the email standing in his kitchen, one hand still on his editing mouse. The first sentence told him the trust had undergone review. The second sentence told him his beneficiary status had been terminated. The third sentence listed the grounds: public conduct that demeans a family elder, documented via live stream on October 11th. He read it 3 times, convinced this was some kind of prank from someone in the chat who had found his email. Then he scrolled down and saw the signature. Margaret Chen, trustee, a contact number. He dialed it immediately, his voice sharp with the confidence of someone who had never faced a consequence that couldn't be argued out of existence. The call lasted 4 minutes. Margaret was calm, clinical, and absolutely immovable. She read him the clause verbatim. She noted that his own grandfather had drafted the language. She explained that the removal was final, with no appeal under the trust instrument's terms. Then she said something that turned his anger cold. "The share previously allocated to you has been redistributed to Emily Halstead and a charitable foundation designated for elder rights advocacy. The effective date is today." Brandon hung up and stared at his editing timeline. The stream was still there, frozen on his grandfather's face. The money he had made that night, $8,200, was sitting in his Pulse account. He did the math suddenly, frantically, the kind of math that happens when your entire financial future snaps into focus. His trust share had been worth roughly $1.5 million. His streaming revenue for the month would cap at maybe $12,000 if he was lucky. He had traded generational wealth for influencer money, but here is where it gets worse. Margaret had also attached a copy of the memorandum she distributed to all trust beneficiaries, which included Richard's 2 other grandchildren, his daughter, and the family attorney. The live stream had been clipped, preserved, and cited as the precipitating event. Every member of the Halstead family now knew exactly what Brandon had done. The humiliation he had designed for public consumption was now permanent family record, and the people whose respect he would eventually need were reading the transcript of him mocking the man who had paid for his braces, his first car, and the private school that got him into the college he currently attended on a full trust-funded scholarship, which was also now under review. Brandon did not tell anyone. He sat with the email for 2 days, uploading the highlights reel anyway, because his algorithm required consistency and he didn't yet understand that his old life was over. The reel hit the Pulse trending page. Donations spiked. Subscribers climbed past 45,000. He read the comments while the trust removal letter sat in his inbox like an undetonated bomb. "Maury grandpa cringe please. Your grandpa is iconic. Make it a series." Each comment was a fresh cut because he now knew that every view was documented, every donation time-stamped, and the woman who controlled his inheritance had already printed them all. Then the second blow landed. Jason, the eldest grandson who had been kicked out of the trust years earlier for drug arrests, posted his own video. He filmed himself reading Brandon's removal letter aloud, laughing and calling it the most satisfying karma I've ever seen. The video went viral in a completely different way, not because of the trust clause, because Jason revealed the family name. He tagged Richard, a retired judge whose appellate opinions were still taught in law schools. He tagged Emily, whose social work caseload included elderly abuse cases. Suddenly, the story was not about a cringe stream, it was about a legacy. News outlets picked it up. A legal blog accepted the conduct clause. A financial planning podcast debated whether generational trusts should all include similar provisions, and somewhere in the middle of this, Brandon lost control of the narrative entirely. The chat that had once celebrated his cruelty was now full of strangers calling him a predator and a con man. The donations dried up. The sponsors quietly ended their ambassador agreements. His Pulse account was demonetized after a wave of reports. The platform that had rewarded his worst instincts abandoned him the moment his brand became toxic. He had set out to become famous. He succeeded. It just wasn't the kind of fame he could cash. But the deepest cut was the one he didn't see coming. Richard never addressed him, not during the news cycle, not in private, not through lawyers. The grandfather who had once spent a whole summer teaching him chess on the back porch simply stopped speaking. He didn't block Brandon's number. He didn't issue a statement. He just became silent, the way a courtroom becomes silent after a verdict is read and the defendant waits for the cuffs. Brandon called his mother, who told him, in a voice he had never heard before, that she was not ready to talk to him. He called Emily, who answered once, said, "I'm using my new distribution to expand elder care services in 3 counties. Thank you for your contribution," and hung up. And then, one night in February, 4 months after the stream, Brandon sat alone in his apartment with the analytical clarity that only total loss provides. He rewatched the stream for the first time since it aired. This time, he was not counting donations. He was watching his grandfather's eyes. He saw the exact moment Richard realized what was happening, the flicker of recognition when Brandon had read the donation message asking him what it felt like to be obsolete. He saw Richard recover, answer with dignity, and continue to treat the conversation as sincere even after he must have known it was not. And he understood, maybe for the first time, what it looked like when someone refused to meet cruelty with cruelty, not because they were weak, but because they had decided that nothing, not even humiliation, would break the person they had chosen to become. Brandon deleted every video from his channel. He recorded no farewell stream, posted no explanation. He simply wiped the archive of mockery and closed the account. Then he drove to his grandfather's house, parked across the street, and sat in his car for 2 hours, trying to find the words for a conversation that might already be over. The study light was on. Richard was inside, probably reading, probably alone. The door was unlocked. It always was. Brandon Halstead never uploaded another video. His name still appears occasionally on forums, a cautionary tale passed between content creators about the day a cringe grandpa stream cost a man his inheritance. But the story people tell misses the part Richard insists matters most. A trust clause can remove a beneficiary. It cannot replace a grandson. Richard knew that when he opened the door that February night, and he knew it when he laid out the conditions. No shortcuts, no cameras, no audience, just Sundays, just chess. Just the slow, unmonetized work of rebuilding something that had taken years to break. Here is the question the internet hasn't figured out how to answer. We live in a world where every moment is potential content and every relationship is a possible revenue stream. How do you protect the people you love from an algorithm that rewards turning them into punchlines? Richard Halstead's answer was a legal document that waited silently for the right trigger. But not everyone has a trust. Not everyone has a conduct clause. Most elders who get mocked online just get mocked. The views pile up, the comments laugh, and no lawyer calls. If this story made you think about someone you should call, pick up the phone before the live stream does. Subscribe if you want more stories about the moments when consequence catches up to content. The door is unlocked. It always is.